Take any can of soup off a grocery shelf right now. It will still be perfectly good to eat 5 years from now, no refrigeration required. 100 years ago, that same bowl of soup would have spoiled within days. So what changed? At this plant, the answer starts with vegetables still cold from this morning's harvest. Carrots, celery, and onions come in first, diced within hours of harvest, then flash frozen so fast they keep their color and crunch. Chicken and beef arrive separately, already simmered into a stock rich enough to smell like dinner already. Here's a choice you never guessed mattered. This plant reaches for frozen diced vegetables over fresh-cut ones. Fresh sounds nicer on the label, but frozen holds its size for months, so today's can tastes like last spring's. And vegetables before water on that label means more of them inside. Vegetables rush into a hopper, closer to hail on a tin roof than dinner.
The stock pours into a steam kettle the size of a small car, and the vegetables tumble in right behind it, along with a starch slurry that turns thin broth into something you'd actually want to eat with a spoon. Salt and spices go in last. Measured to a recipe the plant guards like a family secret. Ask what's in the blend, and you'll get one word: proprietary. One kettle alone holds enough soup to fill over 4,000 cans, and this plant fills a dozen kettles before lunch. Paddles turn slowly through the mixture, a low, steady churn, thick enough now to leave a trail across the surface before folding back in. The finished soup drops into empty cans on a moving line, and here's the part almost nobody pictures. Before the lid ever goes on, each can slides through a chamber that sucks the air out from just above the soup. Skip that, and trapped air would quietly rust the can from the inside, spoiling everything within weeks. Next, a machine called a double seamer folds the lid and can body together, not once, but twice, in a seam so tight it has to overlap by at least 45% or the whole can fails. But the real drama happens next. Racks of sealed cans roll into a chamber and sit inside pressurized steam at 250 degrees for nearly an hour, essentially a pressure cooker built for an army. Workers here don't just eyeball doneness, they track something called an F value, a legal minimum ensuring the heat destroys even a 1 in a trillion chance that a single dangerous spore survives inside. Sealed, silent, and cooking under pressure, the hiss of a steam valve releasing is the only sound in the room. What rolls out the other side isn't just soup in a can anymore. It's soup that could sit in your pantry for years and still be perfectly fine to eat.
Once the cans cool, they roll into a labeling station where a wraparound label glues into place at over 500 cans a minute, faster than your eye can actually follow one can passing. But speed isn't the impressive part. Every seam gets double-checked by a technician trained to read seam cross-sections under magnification, measuring overlap down to a fraction of a millimeter, a skill that takes months to certify, and only a handful of people here currently hold it. That label carries more than a name, too. A printed code ties each can back to the exact batch and shift that made it, so if one is ever flagged, the story behind it traces in minutes. A date coder stamps each can's bottom. A sharp click, repeated hundreds of times a minute, like a tiny factory heartbeat. Labeled cans drop into cardboard trays, get wrapped in shrink film, and roll onto pallets bound for the same pantry shelf they've held for over a century. But that lid is hiding one more detail worth knowing: a slightly concave button stamped right into the top. If that button ever pops outward and stays domed, that's gas building up inside, and that's a can you leave right where it sits. Random cans get cross-sectioned by hand so inspectors can double-check what the automated scanners already caught in motion. If a seam falls even slightly outside spec, that can risk leaking somewhere down the line, but the whole batch tied to that seaming head gets pulled before it ever reaches a truck. Vacuum testers add one more layer, catching the faintest leak long before it ever reaches a shopper's cart. But soup stays safe because heat wipes out everything alive in the can. Pickles pull off the same trick with zero cooking, and most jars sold as fermented never held a living bacterium. An Italian pickle salesman may be the reason the country is even called America.
In the late 1400s, merchant Amerigo Vespucci kept ships stocked with brined vegetables for long voyages. That job continues today at industrial scale. Enough pickles roll off lines like this one to help supply the 5 million pounds Americans eat daily, starting with cucumbers off the truck. Every cucumber here has to earn its spot on the line, and most don't make the cut. This plant uses Kirby cucumbers, smaller and thinner skinned than the waxy ones in a salad bowl, because thin skin lets brine soak through fast, while wax blocks it almost entirely. Size alone decides each cucumber's future. The smallest become whole baby pickles, medium ones turn into spears, and the rest get sliced into sandwich-ready chips. A machine sorts them by rolling cucumbers across widening gaps. A steady clatter of vegetables dropping into their bins, sorted before hand ever touches them. Here's where most assumptions fall apart. This plant skips fermentation entirely. Sorted cucumbers drop straight into a brine of vinegar, salt, and water, with fresh dill and garlic. No weeks waiting on bacteria, just a tank and a clock. Most pickles sold in stores today are made exactly this way, quick brined rather than slow fermented, even ones with fermented printed boldly on the jar. One tank holds enough brine to season 12,000 pounds of cucumbers at once. Dill and garlic tumble into the tank, a green, fragrant splash against steel, and the room smells like a deli before a single lid goes on. Cucumbers on their own don't stand a chance against what comes next. The brine gets pumped hot, and heat is exactly what turns a fresh vegetable limp. Pectin, the natural glue holding cucumber cells together, breaks down fast once temperature climbs. So before heat touches them, a pinch of calcium chloride goes into every batch. Those calcium ions reach into the cucumber and lock its pectin into a tighter structure, cell by cell, so it survives the heat without turning to mush. Skip it, and every pickle on this line comes out soft enough to spread on toast. The filled jars roll into a pasteurization tunnel and soak in 185-degree water for a full 30 minutes, hot enough to make the vegetable inside shelf-stable for over a year without ever touching a fridge. Steaming hot, sealed tight, and still holding its bite. The tunnel hisses as jars roll through in tight rows. What comes out the other end, once cooled, still snaps like the cucumber that walked in. Once the jar is cool, a technician pulls samples and does something you'd never expect from a factory line. They bite into a raw pickle right there on the floor, judging crunch by feel before any machine gets a say. That kind of taste tasting takes years to trust. Here's a detail almost nobody knows. Leftover brine from these tanks doesn't get dumped. It gets filtered, bottled separately, and sold on its own as a sports drink, prized for the same electrolytes athletes chase in a locker room. Machines apply labels at close to 300 jars a minute, each stamped with a use-by date in a fraction of a second. A capping machine twists each lid down, a tight mechanical squeal. Then silence, then the next jar.
Jars get boxed a dozen at a time, shrink-wrapped, and loaded onto pallets bound for the same deli counters and sandwich shops you've grabbed a spear from without wondering how it got so loud when you bit into it. One more detail worth knowing. Cloudy brine isn't spoilage, it's just garlic and spice settling out of solution, completely normal, and a sign the jar is doing exactly what it should. Random jars get cracked open by hand, checked for crunch, color, and brine clarity against a reference sample. If a batch of cucumbers came in slightly overripe, the pickles turn soft weeks later, long after shipping. But that reference sample catches the drift early. A batch that fails gets reworked into relish instead of tossed. A metal detector gives every jar one last pass before it reaches a shopper's cart. But pickles rarely stay in their own jar. Chopped into canned tuna, they make a lunchbox classic. Getting that tuna safe from the can takes something a pickle never needs: 2 rounds of cooking.
Canned tuna wasn't anyone's plan, it was a backup. In 1903, a California cannery ran short on sardines, and rather than let its empty tin sit idle, one canner steamed a local albacore until it turned pale and mild, then sold it as a cheap stand-in for chicken.
It worked almost too well. At this plant, that same fish now arrives already frozen solid, straight off a boat. The fish comes off the boat already frozen solid, caught and flash frozen within hours to lock in freshness. This plant runs two species side by side: skipjack, small and abundant, and albacore, larger and paler fleshed. Skipjack becomes the darker, flakier tuna labeled chunk light. Albacore becomes the milder tuna labeled solid white, and it costs more since one albacore yields far more usable loin per fish. That label isn't marketing. It's basically a receipt for which fish paid for dinner. Frozen fish thump onto a steel table. A hollow, dense knock, nothing like fresh fish on the dock. Before this fish ever sees a can, it gets cooked once already, a step most people have no idea exists. Thawed fish load into steam ovens and cook low and slow for hours, depending on size, until the flesh turns firm enough to handle by hand. This first cook isn't about flavor, it's about texture. Raw tuna would fall apart the moment anyone tried to clean it. One steaming batch can hold over 10,000 pounds of fish at once, cooking through evenly before a single knife touches it. Steam hisses through the vents as the oven seals shut. A long, low exhale, like the room is holding its breath.
Here's where the fish stops looking like fish at all. Once cooked, whole tuna move to a table where workers strip away skin, bones, and dart bloodline meat by hand, leaving only clean, pale loins behind. That dark meat isn't wasted. It gets diverted for pet food and fish sauce, so nothing here goes in the trash. The remaining loins get sliced and packed into cans with water, oil, or broth, and this is where most people assume the story ends. It doesn't. Every sealed can now goes into a retort chamber and cooks a second time under intense steam pressure for over an hour, the same trick that makes a can of soup shelf stable. Skip that second cook, and a sealed can becomes the perfect breeding ground for exactly the bacteria this process exists to destroy. Pale, dense, and packed tight, the retort door seals shut with a heavy metallic clunk. What rolls out afterward has been cooked twice, sealed once, and made safe for years on a shelf. Once the cans cool, they roll under a labeling station that wraps close to 400 cans a minute. But the label itself is doing more work than it looks like. That dolphin safe symbol printed in the corner isn't just a feel-good sticker. It represents an entire tracking system, one that follows this exact fish from the boat that caught it to the can it ends up in, verifying the method used never involved chasing dolphins to find the school. Very few people outside the industry realize how far back that trail goes. Every can traces to one specific vessel and one specific day at sea. A date coder stamps the bottom of each can.
A sharp mechanical click repeated hundreds of times a minute.
Cans get cased 24 at a time, shrink-wrapped, and palletized for the same pantry shelf where they've sat next to soup and pickles for generations. One more detail worth knowing before lunch: that liquid inside isn't just filler. Oil-packed tuna holds up better against the second cook, staying tender, while water-packed tuna loses a bit more moisture and flavor to the process. Every batch gets tested for something most people never heard of: histamine, which builds up if raw fish sits too long before processing, invisible to taste or smell. High histamine causes real illness no amount of cooking fixes, but strict time limits between catch and cook, backed by lab testing, catch the problem long before a can ships. A metal detector gives each can one final pass before it heads out the door. But tuna survives on a shelf by beating one invisible enemy, cooked out twice. Peanuts hide an invisible enemy of their own, and roasting destroys up to 90% of it before grinding begins. Americans eat roughly 700 million pounds of peanut butter every year, enough to coat the entire floor of the Grand Canyon. A century ago, none of it stayed smooth for long. Oil and paste split apart in the jar unless someone stirred it every single time. At this plant, that same peanut starts out buried underground, dug up by the truckload. The peanuts arrive by the truckload, still in papery shells, fresh off farms where they spent months buried underground, rather than hanging on a branch.
This plant runs mostly on runner peanuts, smaller and more uniform than the big Virginia peanuts sold in shell at ball games, so they roast evenly through a batch. But growing underground creates a hidden risk most people never think about. Warm, damp soil is exactly where a mold that produces a dangerous toxin thrives. Every load gets scanned before approval. Shelled peanuts pour into a holding bin, a dry, rattling cascade, thousands hitting steel at once. That toxin risk doesn't get eliminated by scanning alone, it gets cooked out. Peanuts roll into a roaster past 400 degrees, and the heat does double duty. It deepens that familiar nutty aroma, and it destroys up to 90% of any lingering toxin before the batch moves on. 10 minutes changes everything. Pale, raw peanuts turn deep golden brown, and the smell alone could pull someone in from across a parking lot. Skins loosen enough to rub away entirely, along with the bitter little heart tucked inside. Peanuts tumble into the roaster drum, a low, tumbling rumble, like distant thunder rolling through steel. Here's where whole peanuts stop being peanuts and start being something you'd spread on toast.
Roasted nuts drop into a grinder and hit blades spinning fast enough to shear through cell walls in a fraction of a second. And that's the real trick. Peanuts are nearly 50% oil, but as long as cell walls stay intact, that oil stays locked inside. The instant those walls break, oil floods out and the mixture turns from crumbly grit into glossy paste in about one pass. This plant pushes through several tons of peanuts an hour, enough to fill tens of thousands of jars before a shift ends. But raw peanut butter wants to misbehave. Left alone, that oil slowly rises back to the surface, so a small amount of stabilizer blends in right at the grinder, locking the paste into one smooth texture that never needs a stir. Thick, glossy, and impossibly smooth. The grinder's low mechanical growl barely changes pitch as thousands of pounds pass through every hour. Once the paste cools slightly, jars fill on a line running close to 200 units a minute, but the fill itself is trickier than it looks. Peanut butter has to hit the jar warm enough to pour, yet cool enough that it doesn't shrink and leave a gap once it sets. Technicians calibrate that fill temperature constantly, since a few degrees off means jars that look half empty on a shelf. There's a reason crunchy varieties feel different too. Chopped roasted peanut pieces fold back into the smooth base right before filling, measured to the gram so every jar delivers the same crunch. A capping machine twists each lid down, a tight, decisive squeal, then a hiss as the vacuum seal pulls flat.
Jars get boxed a dozen at a time, shrink-wrapped and palletized for the exact shelf where a jar has sat in nearly every American pantry for generations. One detail worth remembering next time you open a fresh jar: that thin layer of oil pooled on top of natural peanut butter isn't a flaw. It's proof nothing artificial was added to hold the peanut together. Just peanuts, doing exactly what peanuts do. Every batch gets tested twice for that same toxin. Roasting was because a factory this size can't trust one line of defense. If a sample ever comes back above the legal limit, the entire batch gets pooled and destroyed before a single jar reaches a truck. A separate lab checks moisture, texture, and spreadability against a reference standard. Only after both tests pass does a case get cleared for shipping. Next time you spread a spoonful across toast, remember, it's one tiny piece of 700 million pounds a year, and every ounce of it beat a legal limit, a roast, and a lab test to get there.